No, it's not a good morning. This is the Sikhs panel, and this panel is on white supremacy, violence, right-wing politics, and the Sikhs. Our first presenter, Randeep Hothi, investigates Sikh diasporic formations, focusing specifically on racialization and secularization, public formation, and community-operated media projects. His work is grounded in long-term situated ethnographic fieldwork that follows trans-regional sociocultural networks, relaying between Sikh communities in the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, continental Europe, and India. The ethnographic research informed his investments in philosophy, critical theory, and social theory, and he is defending his PhD in the departments of Anthropology and Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Michigan. Presenting the predication, subjective capture, translation of white supremacist violence, semiotics problems of the Sikh. I hand it over to Randeep Hothi.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Adam. Thanks to Dr. Jasbir Singh for this invitation and for the community for funding this, this event. On August 5th, 2012, a white supremacist descended upon a... You would like me to speak louder?
Yes, please. Just get it closer to mouth,
Okay, does this work? Does this work? Is this microphone on?
I don't think the mics are working anyway, are they? Only for the recording.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so I have thought about an ethnographic project about the secondary person who comes and adjusts the mic at all these events. I've thought about that, so. On August 5th, 2012, white supremacists descended upon a gurdwara in Wisconsin, leaving 7 killed and several injured in what was then purported to be the bloodiest massacre of any religious community in the United States since the Birmingham church bombings of 1963. As journalists flooded the small town of Oak Creek, the shooting ascended as the latest hate crime to saturate the national news cycle. But though cable news networks condemned the racism thought to motivate the violence, the news coverage strained to identify the slain. Over the subsequent week, news reports arrived at a sense of the victims, revealing incrementally that they were Sikhs, that they hail from Punjab, that they follow Sikhism. But though the news coverage underwrote the tragedy of a little-known community victimized for the conspicuous turbans and beards, the vexing question of their nature became an ongoing preoccupation for news media. Of course, in the wake of 9/11, Sikhs have become actionable targets of fatal violence under what Anthropology calls the racial sovereignty of transnational white patriarchy. Under such a regime, Sikh men have become renowned as particularly ironic victims of violence, according to what Jasbir calls a hypothesis of mistaken identity, which proposes that anti-Sikh violence in the diaspora stems from a conflation between the, quote, monstrous turbans and beards of the Sikh body and the overdetermined figurations of the terrorist. Academic and popular responses alike have since attempted to correct the misrecognition of the Sikh as if it could be properly recognized, as if the Sikh could be something that were intelligible. My concern, however, is the misrecognition of the nature of this misrecognition. My talk today probes the very constitution of a subject, interrogating the two master categories under which the misrecognition becomes possible, the juncture of race and religion. In this brief talk, I seek to bridge two important literatures, the critical study of race and ethnicity and the critical study of religion. In doing so, I examine specifically the way that the Sikh is construed under the auspices of overcoming a misrecognition. Within hours of the Oak Creek shooting at about 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, CNN broadcasted a news program to introduce and offer a framework for viewers to understand religion and its role in public life in the United States. The program host introduces Eric Meripodi, editor of CNN's Belief blog, an authority on Sikh Americans. In the interactional division of labor characteristic of American cable news programs, the host takes the role of asking questions on behalf of imagined viewers, and the subject area expert offers expert knowledge about the nature of the Sikh. Here, the host tracks and tacks between two stances. On the one hand, commenting on a montage of images portraying devotional worship in the Gurdwara setting, and on the other hand, issuing freestanding explanations about the nature of Sikh Americans and Sikhism. After about a minute, the host asks a question about whether these people are violent, and that is what I wish to focus on today.
Ready?
You can see this is some footage from the Belief blog from earlier last year of what a temple service looks like in the Gurdwara. What goes on? You see the music and the prayers and the devotion. And then after this service where they're focusing on the scripture, underneath that canopy, you'll see them go and practice this act of a communal meal, the langar, which we heard of the women were preparing in this incident, going and working in the kitchen. And you can see the colorful saris that the women are wearing. This is part of Indian fashion, and you'll see the heads covered with the men and the women as they focus on the scripture and prayer, sitting on the floor, feet off, no shoes on, and of course, bowing in prayer and meditation as they go through hymns and scripture there as part of their worship services.
And the pictures that we're showing, it's just a beautiful spectacle there of ceremony and worship, of a time of peace, obviously, and celebration. I would think this morning, Eric, when you talk about the faith of these people and the basis of, some religions will, eye for an eye, others will turn the other cheek and forgive. What do you know about how they think going forward in a situation like this?
Incredibly peaceful folks. The tenets of the faith are meditation on God, hard work, and community service. This is not a faith where we're going to see, I think, a retaliation in the other way. We're looking for revenge. I think we're going to see an incredibly peaceful response from the Sikh community, something we've been seeing a little bit in some of the responses that we've been getting in statements from Sikh groups around the country. Again, incredibly peaceful folks.
An eye for an eye, or turn the other cheek. These are the stances that the imagined viewership is inhabiting for the program host. Here a number of questions arise. Why is it that at the very moment in which Sikhs are subject to white supremacist violence, they are the ones who are interrogated for whether their disposition is a violent one? What exactly is at stake in this description, which asks whether Sikh moral sensibilities align with that of the Old Testament, or instead the teachings conveyed by Jesus? What exactly are audiences supposed to learn about these people? I offer one explanation. At stake in the spectacular publicity of white supremacist violence is a global hierarchy of consciousness in which the Sikh subject must be placed. The Sikh subject is judged for its capacity to be autonomous, exhibit freedom, and overcome itself even though the signifier consciousness is never explicitly mentioned in the broadcast. Scholars in the critical study of religion and ethnicity have, of course, long shown that race is a construct born of the power-laden processes of racialization, disjoint projects that emerge in early modern Europe and which have become globalized. For the Sikh subject, key moments in the process of racialization include some of the touch points that we've looked at over the last day or two. Early colonial travel accounts, colonial governmentality, 19th century migration experiences, juridical decisions, multicultural governmentality, the global war on terror, and so forth. However, it was in the British colonization of South Asia and the annexation of the Sikh Empire in the 19th century that the Sikh subject was racialized in biological terms, in the service of recruiting martial races in whose loyalty served the empire. The historical anthropologist Richard Fox describes the biological imaginary, in which Sikhs are lions, quote, a martial, courageous, and stalwart species of men and women, but also one periodically mastered and used. The imagery elucidates British colonial orientations and policies, specifically in the ways their culturally given beliefs in biological determinism constituted their relationship with the Singhs. A modern understanding of race here is distinct from group formation under tribal, casteist, and kinship rubrics because its justification lays in, amongst other things, in the workings of natural, and in this case, biological law. Here, I take my cue from Black feminist theoretician Denise Ferreira da Silva, who probes raciality as constitutive of modern subjectivity. At stake in raciality, according to Da Silva, is a rubric to determine the degree to which consciousness is able to overcome itself. The modern subject is characteristically divided. It consists in consciousness, which is taken to obey natural law, and self-consciousness, the ability for consciousness to transcend its own self by cognizing itself as its own object. So at stake is a distinction between consciousness and self-consciousness, which delineates the aspect that is animalistic, brute, unthinking, in other words, biological, and the aspect that overcomes itself, becoming self-determining, autonomous, free, and therefore liberal. This is why Da Silva calls raciality an arsenal. It prepares racialized subjects for violence according to the degree that the subject is unable to achieve self-consciousness, because a consciousness that is unable to achieve self-consciousness is closer to brute nature than human freedom. We see this all over early modern philosophy in the ways, for instance, that Hegel discusses sort of primitive shamanism, which is more in touch with animal life, as opposed to enlightened deism, which is more sort of associated with modern Europe. Thus, the subjects that require brute force are the ones that have yet to assume true self-consciousness. Because of the translatability, excuse me, the undeveloped consciousness demands government by violence, much in the way that an animal requires entrainment, and is itself prone to violence because it is the only language that it understands. This becomes, of course, a justification for why others require violence to become free, whereas Europe doesn't require violence to become free. Here, I simply notice a parallel in the critical study of religion, thinking of scholars like Assad, Nongbri, Masuzawa, and others, in which religion itself is a construct born of the power-laden process of secularization. For instance, the religion making of a Sikhism, a colonial knowledge product created into a world religion. As Arvind Mandare and others have shown, the Sikh subject is relatedly particularized within a typology of world religions which span from the self-consciousness exhibited by secular Europe to the brute consciousness exhibited in indigenous animisms and shamanisms. So where does Sikhism lie in this spectrum? Becomes an important question. I am emphasizing that the categorical juncture of race and religion allows us to probe the very substance that makes the human, which is self-consciousness or the lack thereof. And here, the critical scholar of race, gender, and Islam, Sunera Thabani, finds that what De Silva calls an analytics of raciality and what Mandare calls an analytic of secularity not only mutually inform one another in their co-emergence, but are crucial in the very constitution of the West itself. So I now want to turn back. And direct our attention to the televisual text, which I examined at the outset of this talk. I was perplexed by an anxiety registered at the very introduction, description, and explanation of the Sikh subject. The concern was whether Sikhs would seek revenge, whether they index an eye for an eye of the Old Testament and of the Jewish religion, or whether they exhibit an ethics of turning the other cheek, of the New Testament and of Christianity. Now, in the development of the modern subject, and specifically the modern subject of religion, the difference between Christianity and Judaism is a particularly important site through which the supremacy of the prior, of Christianity, is grounded. Christianity is universal because it overcomes Judaism, which is particular because its ethnicity is bound up with the divine. Thus, whereas anyone can presumably become Christian, not anyone can become Jewish, according to the logic of race and religion that I'm trying to probe here, which I think becomes at stake in the way we want to think about the ways in which turning the other cheek is particularistic, is universal, whereas eye for an eye might not be. So at stake is whether the Sikh subject instantiates a truly transcendent religion like Christianity, or whether it is instead an ethnic religion like that of the Jews, and therefore the sense in which raciality should articulate with religion as a rubric to understand the subject. The program host frames the contrast between the New Testament's God of forgiveness and the Old Testament's God of vengeance when he says, quote, "Eric, when you talk about the faith of these people and the basis of, some religions will eye for an eye and others will turn the other cheek and forgive. What do you know about how they think going forward in a situation like this?" That is, the program is interested in whether, for Sikh Americans, divine law legislates violence on behalf of the particular, or whether its providence is universal. At stake is whether the religion is just rather than retributive, and therefore whether the subjectivity at issue is properly able to stand above and liberate itself from the reactive violence of brute ethnic consciousness. Therefore, although national news coverage promises social repair by issuing narrations designed to overcome social rupture, such discourses can be understood as the second moment of violence. My focus on the symbolic violence contributes to scholarship that calls for an analysis of the structure of white supremacy, which can be otherwise analytically occluded by a blinkered focus on punctuated spectacles of bodily trespass alone. I therefore understand the construal of Sikh subjectivity in the wake of such spectacular white supremacist violence as symbolic violence. The second moment of violence, in which an anxiety about Sikh violence, is the moment in which the Sikh subject is racialized and secularized by fixing it in a hierarchy of race and religion. In this case, somewhere between the transcendent self-restraint of Christianity and the reactive violence of the Semite. I therefore propose an analytic pivot away from misrecognition of race and religion to focus instead on what might be at stake in both of these categories. The rubric of misrecognition can misdirect us insofar as it frames racialization as an epistemic problem. It grounds the problem of race as a problem created by wrong-headed knowledge, a problem of faulty knowledge. Second, the rubric of misrecognition can presume that recognition could be possible. Because such misrecognition is inaccurate, imprecise, and wrong-headed about the nature of these people with respect to their race or their religion. Instead, rather than misrecognition, I wish to shift our analysis of Sikh subjectivity towards the study of racialization. After all, raciality is not only a misrecognition of bodies, it is also productive of them. According to De Silva, the productive will to truth authorizes the creation of various and diverse kinds of human beings, as it has instituted subjects that stand differently before the universal. Racialization and secularization offer better ways to understand misrecognition precisely because misrecognition is productive and it creates new kinds of subjectivities. Second, racialization and secularization are pedagogical instruments that instruct and direct desire of who should die and who should perish. And in doing so, the moral status of different kinds of people are at stake, as the CNN excerpt suggests. I now conclude this brief paper by reiterating the juncture of race and religion as modern categories that are productive of subjectivity. In the very moment that victimhood is inscribed, the uneven categorical nexus of race and religion are deployed in the symbolic violence of reproducing a sense of who these people are. In the wake of Oak Creek, news discourses on hate crimes devise a sympathetic subject around which social repair turns on precisely the propensity of their violence at the same moment that they're understood as victims. And in examining the workings of these categories together, we can see that what is at stake in these categories is something that I'm calling consciousness, the ability for the self to overcome itself and achieve an instantiation of liberal subjectivity, which is scrutinized at that very moment of its inspection. It is this, I think, that better captures the stakes of misrecognition, not only a prophylaxis against bodily trespass and psychic injury. Thank you.
Testing. No? Still nothing? Okay. Our next presenter, Puninder Singh, is a doctoral candidate in linguistic anthropology at the University of Michigan. His research focuses on language and language use in the Sikh tradition, Sikh philosophy, Sikh interpretive traditions, pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial knowledge formations, and interactions between Sikhi and other traditions. Now presenting Sikhs and right-wing politics in America, Puninder Singh.
Thank you. You can turn on the display. And then, thank you all. Thank Pasaraji for another wonderful gathering. Can you all hear me in the back? Yeah. Okay. Cool. This is one of my favorite meetings. You know, it's the only time I get to come to California, wonderful sunny California, and it's always a pleasure to reestablish, get in touch with everybody again and see everybody. And this has been a particularly wonderful conference, this topic especially. I think it's been a long time in coming. Many of us have been thinking through these topics, and it's a good opportunity to start, the conversation about this topic, which hasn't been discussed within Sikh Studies enough yet. So this is a wonderful beginning to that, I hope. So the paper I'm going to present today, it touches on virtually all the topics we've heard from all the papers from yesterday and today. All wonderful papers, wonderful panels. So I look forward to hearing your all's input into this, because I think it touches on everyone's research in one way or the other. When I first submitted this paper, Sikhs and right-wing politics in America, when I saw the program, I realized that people are probably going to construe this as meaning Sikhs who are encountering, persons of the right-wing persuasion in America, something like that, right? That's sort of the default understanding. That's what I saw when I read my paper title. And I was like, that's not exactly what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about Sikhs who have embraced right-wing politics, which is something I haven't seen really talked about either in academia or in more popular forums. But it's a phenomenon it exists very much. And I think this phenomenon is going to give us a lot of insight into the larger question I've been thinking about for quite some time, and several of us have. The main question I'm looking at is, how do Sikh values articulate with the wider social structures that we engage with? In particular, how do they engage with what we might call a conventional political spectrum in the different nation states in which Sikhs have found themselves settled? So as we heard from Dr. Korean yesterday, the different nation states have different political systems. What right-wing means in America is different from what right-wing means in, say, Europe, in the UK, in Canada, and so on and so forth. So the spectra are socially variable, right? But we, as the Sikh community, has settled in all different parts of the world. So how do we engage with these various political spectra? How do Sikh values manifest themselves? So I'm interested in political manifestations, political histories, and political outcomes, right? So not just Sikh values from an ideal perspective, but how do we actually live them? What kind of opportunities do we have to express Sikh values within these conventional political systems? And I'll start by saying at the outset that Sikh values, I take them to be a constellation, a dialogic formation that's expressed in musical, poetic, aesthetic, and affective forms, right? So it's not, Sikh value system is not something that's conducive to being listed, inscribed in a list or something like that, but it's a lived philosophy that is in deep engagement with the social surround. And we can look to Guru Nanak Ji's Siddh Ghosh composition, which is a record of his dialogue with the Nath Yogis. So that's a model of this dialogic engagement with the traditions around the normative Sikh tradition, if you will. So that's how I take Sikh value. So it's not this one singular thing that can be inscribed in a list, but it's this engagement, social engagement, dialogical engagement, philosophical engagement. So I take this. So how do we, when we look at how Sikh values articulate with political systems, I take this as a project of translation. It's a question of sovereignty as well, right? Does Sikh sovereignty, as I take it, is the mastery of ego to get in touch with hukam, to live according to hukam? Does that always match up with the possibilities that are afforded by different political systems? For instance, the hegemonic liberal idea of freedom, does that really match up with Sikhi or not? That's a question. So I'm going to pose that as a question. I hope we'll be able to expand on that in our discussion. So I'm not going to provide a prescriptive solution to the question. There's no way I can do that in 15 and 20 minutes. This is a very complex and deep question. So I'm just using this as an opportunity to begin a conversation, which I don't think it has been had. I think a lot of us think about it subconsciously. We live it when we live within different kinds of political structures, and we find ourselves maybe bumping against different kind of limits to our lived experience as Sikhs, and so on and so forth. So I also wanted to show that I can hang with millennials, and I'm going to try to crowdsource my paper a little bit. So I want to get everyone's input on it. So it's not something, again, I'm not here to provide a prescription, but I want to, this is something that has to be done in the form of Sangha, right? The idea of Sikh values is a, as I said, it's a constellation of ideas that have been transmitted through history in a community. It's not just a set of doctrine. So that's something that's important. I think we need to start engaging in this conversation. And it's historically variable, right? When we live in different societies, there are different possibilities and so on and so forth. So we need to have that, open up that discussion. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Sikhs who have embraced right-wing politics. This is a relatively new phenomenon, especially in the public sphere. I'm going to talk about a little bit about some anecdotal histories about Sikhs and Republicans that go back beyond the last 10 years or so. But at least in the public sphere, this has been a very rare phenomenon, Sikhs engaging with the Republican Party or right-wing politics. Whatever you think about right-wing politics, I think this topic gives us a chance to engage with the question of how Sikh values engage with political spectra without simply defaulting to the hegemonic liberal formation, because that's the default idea about Asian Americans in general, that they sort of default to a centrist, maybe slightly left centrist kind of political affiliation. So there was a Pew Research poll just last year during the American congressional midterm elections 2022, and the poll indicated that among Asian Americans English-speaking Asian Americans who plan to vote in the midterm elections, it was a question about their who will they vote for in their local congressional election, a congressional district, right, for House of Representatives. And in that poll last year, 57% of the respondents said that they were planning to vote for the Democratic candidate in their district, and 26% said they were planning to vote for the Republican candidate. So we see here a massive affiliation with the Democratic Party, more than 2-to-1, more than 2/3 of the respondents. So there are people who said they're going to vote Republican, but the vast majority said they're going to vote for the Democratic side. And this is the typical, I think, common sense understanding of Asian Americans, that they align with the Democratic Party, they align left, and so on and so forth. But in this phenomenon I'm going to talk about today, we see that's not always necessarily the case. But again, this gives us an idea, instead of just defaulting to that common sense idea that Asian Americans are Democrats, Sikhs are always Democrats, and so on and so forth. This opens up the question. So we can think, how do Sikh values align with the political spectrum, and do they align with the political spectrum? So I also wanted to say that Sikh values or spiritual values in general, they don't necessarily find their expression in conventional politics. And that can be part of spiritual values too, that conventional politics are not an adequate space to express spiritual values. So that I want to leave that on the table. But I am going to, since we do engage with actual political structures, this is what I'm trying to do in this project, to see how that manifests itself. Okay. So something that I've noticed in my research is that Sikh values political actors, activists from both sides of the political spectrum, as we're going to see today in some of the examples I have, they both make the claim that Sikh values are American values. But they make the claim from the right wing, and they make the claim from the left wing. So we see activist groups. We have Sikh Coalition and many of our activist groups. They tend to be centered or slightly left center. They say Sikh values are American values. People I'm going to talk about today also are saying, from a far right perspective, that Sikh values are American values. So how can these both be the case? That's what we need to really think critically about what Sikh values are, and again, where do they fit along that spectrum? The second question I want to look at today is why the question of immigration is such a topic of concern for all these activists, especially on the right. And why is immigration the place where Sikhs and Asian Americans and South Asians in general, I'm going to talk about some comparative cases in the UK. Why is immigration the most hot button issue? Why is that the intersection where the values of children of immigrants need to be articulated in a public way? And I want to think about also what affordances, incentives, and opportunities do right-wing politics offer? If it goes against the mainstream common sense understanding, what's being offered by embracing the right wing? There's something there. There's some kind of incentive structure. There's some kind of opportunity. That's my contention. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about an anecdotal example of engagement with Republican politics. So I'm going to talk about my father. My late father came here in the late 1960s, in the post-1965 wave of immigration. which I bet many of us, the younger people in the audience, probably are offspring of that generation, people who came in the 60s and 70s, and maybe in the 80s and 90s now. So he came here in the late 60s, and this is, according to his discussions with me over the last maybe 5 to 10 years, we started really discussing politics quite a lot. He told me that he voted Republican from the time he arrived here. I think the first election he was able to vote in was in the late 70s when he became a naturalized citizen. He voted Republican in every election. By then he was a small business owner, he was an engineer, he had a small consulting firm. So he voted, as he told me, on strictly economic basis, just taxes, basically, corporate taxes. Whoever promised the lowest tax rate, that's who he's going to vote for. He wasn't really concerned about the social issues at the time. So he voted Republican through I think the first election was probably Reagan in 1980. So all through about the year 2000, he voted for the Republican candidate, regardless of what else was happening socially and so on and so forth. That changed with the Iraq War and the invasion of Afghanistan in the aughts, right, in the first decade of the 21st century. He regarded those as unjust wars that couldn't be justified. And for the first time in his life as an immigrant, this was a little over 30 years after he had arrived in America, he decided he couldn't vote for the Republican. His conscience wouldn't let him vote for the Republican Party anymore. So from then on, from the 2008 election, Obama's first term, he voted for the Democratic candidate, and as he told me, from then on he voted Democrat because he was concerned about the social fabric of the United States. So this is an anecdotal story, but I've spoken to many people of his generation, people who were born around the 1940s to 1960, around what we call in America the baby boom generation, but they were born in India, Pakistan, and so on and so forth. But that generation, I find this to be a very typical political trajectory for many people. So they began voting for, as many immigrants, they came here, their main concern was establishing an economic base for themselves, right? Survival, establishing a household, having children, and so on and so forth. It was several decades into his immigrant journey that he felt settled enough and comfortable enough in the society to start not only thinking about but acting on his social concerns as well. So I found this to be a very kind of typical journey. So all that to say that there have been associations with the Republican Party earlier. They weren't always necessarily democratic, but in the last 10 years or so, we've seen a shift to what we might call the far right. And this has been a long time in coming as well. It didn't start with Donald Trump. This started way in the 40s and 50s with the anti-communist movement, Barry Goldwater, some of you know those names. More recently, the Tea Party, Pat Buchanan, I seen Lou shaking. Those people of those generation know these names, right? So the Tea Party is more recent. So this has been a long time coming. Trump is just a manifestation of this wave that's been coming for a half a century, right? He's just the tip of an iceberg that's been there for a long time. So the association we're seeing now with Sikhs embracing the right wing is a different kind of Republican Party than it was in the 1960s and 1970s. There has been a group based in the Baltimore area called Sikhs for Trump. I'm sorry, Sikhs for America first. Sikhs for America. It was established maybe 10 years ago. They participate in the 4th of July parade and stuff like that as a Sikh contingent. It's a very well-known and popular group in the Washington, D.C. metro area. There was a splinter group that formed out of that Sikhs for America called Sikhs for Trump in the run-up to this 2016 election, Donald Trump's first foray into the presidential election. And this caused a grievous split within the Sikhs for America group, which is a big umbrella group, many of whom refused to give their support to Donald Trump in that election. But the issue was that the leadership of both groups, Sikhs for America and Sikhs for Trump, were essentially the same leadership. So I'm just going to give you one example of the kind of rhetoric that came out of that Sikhs for Trump group. And let's see if this works.
We are choosing President Trump and electing him to be the president of this great nation We're not casting vote or choosing him to become president of a Gurudwara or to become a priest of a temple or a mosque. He has all the credentials to become the president of this nation. He has proven in the last 4 years what he has done for this country, how he has boosted the economy, how he has handled foreign trade relations, how he has made our country so strong, our military so strong, and how we are winning everywhere.
Modi is also winning everywhere.
For now. Okay, so again, whatever you think about this side of politics and things like that, I want us to think about, take a step back, and there's a sensational. I wanted to play that specifically so you guys know it's a real thing. There are Sikhs for Trump. It's a real group. It's not a large group, but it exists, right? So that's something we want to take into account. It's part of they're part of the Sikh Panth. They are asserting that Sikh values are Republican values, and voting for Donald Trump is a Sikh practice. So we want to take that as scholars and community members. We want to take that into account, right? These things are happening. They're happening in the name of Sikhi, so it's important to take that into account. So Harmeet Singh, Harmeet Kaur is a many of you some of you probably know her personally. She's been the California the leader of the California Republican Party, chairwoman, I think, for several years. She's a very prominent Republican activist in California. It's a futile battle in California, but someone has to do it. But she's made a name for herself as a national political figure, right? This is a photo of her. She famously did Ardas at the Republican National Convention in 2016, which was the convention that nominated Donald Trump to be the Republican candidate, right? So this was the first time, as she asserted, that Sikh Ardas has been performed at this level in the at a national political convention. It was very widely reported in the news at that time, and so on and so forth. So I put this in because she's very forthright about asserting that Sikh values are equivalent to Republican values, as you see in this photo. In the next couple examples I'm going to give, I'm going to give you a couple of examples now of Harmeet Kaur and another prominent Sikh Republican, Nikki Haley, who announced her candidacy. She's running for president. She's aiming for the Republican nomination. She announced last month or the month before. And I'll come to, in a moment, to her identity as a Sikh. So she doesn't identify as a Sikh, but I'll come to that in a moment. So in these couple of clips, I want us to pay attention to the kind of tropes that they embrace. Again, as I mentioned earlier, immigration is a key issue that all of these sort of minority Republicans embrace or are compelled to embrace, possibly. So I want you to pay attention to their language, how they speak about immigration, and how these patterns get repeated in
my concern I want to add, though, is that this still leaves a huge disparity and dichotomy between the way that the laws are being enforced and the rhetoric is actually ramping up against illegal immigrants, of which, by the way, I am one, and a citizen, and illegal immigrants. So I think we see a frustration on the part of the administration. They seem to be unable, because of Democratic blockage, to do anything about the illegal immigration problem and the border wall and so forth. So they're cracking down on legal immigrants. So I think we have to do both. I think it's fair to hold people accountable. But what about the huge number of illegal immigrants taking advantage of our system?
Okay, there's a couple things I want you to pay attention to there. She said a legal immigrant, of which I am one, and I'm a citizen, right? So we'll see that rhetoric get repeated. I think I have one more clip from another segment. This was the same interview, but there was the other guest spoke in between, so I just kind of spliced it.
Well, who's complaining, Shannon? The actual people who are complaining, like myself, who had to step over people lying in the streets to get here to the studio in San Francisco, we citizens are complaining, but the politicians in Sacramento do not care. They are not complaining. They think that our state is great as a haven for more and more people who do not pay their way here. And of course, that a remark by the state senator was predicated upon, oh, they also pay taxes. That is a fallacy. They hardly pay any taxes. They pay sales taxes, but most of the time they actually use Social Security numbers that are fake. They don't pay the same taxes as all of us do, and they are now going to be enjoying these benefits.
Okay, so again, just keep these in mind for a moment. I'm going to now turn to Nikki Haley. Okay, so Nikki Haley was born into a Sikh family in a rural South Carolina. She became an evangelical Christian, I believe, in her mid-20s. She's just turned 50 recently, so half of her life she's identified as evangelical Christian, right? So she doesn't identify as a Sikh religiously currently, but I included her in this group as Sikhs who have embraced right-wing politics because she does deploy her identity strategically at various times. So about 2 decades ago, on a voter registration card in South Carolina, she identified herself as white. In recent political speeches, she has variously represented herself as a daughter of immigrants. I think she's going to say in this clip, a daughter of immigrants, a daughter of Indian immigrants, and a daughter of Sikh immigrants sometimes, according to the audience she's speaking to, right? So she does strategically employ this identity, even though she doesn't really identify religiously as a Sikh person.
When she went to the bar sahib, she said she both a Sikh and a Christian.
Well, yeah, okay. I don't have time to go into that. That was a very interesting meeting. So she grew up in a rural environment in the South. She apparently didn't have really any connection with Sikhi. There weren't gurdwaras around. So, I want to be generous with her as, I don't want to condemn her for, embracing Christianity. She grew up in an evangelical Christian. So I don't have time to go into that right now, but that was an important interview. And she was in tears when she went to Darbar Sahib, and she said, I didn't know that this was what Sikhi was, when she experienced Kirtan. Okay, so I want to give her a pass on that, but she's doing other things. I'm not going to give her a pass on, which okay. Let me play this. So,
you are aware that her parents are, 5 years. You know that.
I know that, yeah. She was born in a Sikh family, I mentioned.
Accrued and her parents were there about 15 years ago. And back then she was nothing but Gundala. But you talk to them, they look straight from Punjab. There's nothing.
Yeah, they do, yeah.
And to follow up on Dr. Punender's comment, her parents were founders of the Sangat in South Carolina, and frankly, founders, along with Harmeet's parents, of the entire Carolina Sangat.
Right. She's from North Carolina, right?
Yeah,
Harmeet,
but they were integrated, and their families grew up together.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Now that's an insight, another insight.
Good. Well, let's open this up into discussion, because otherwise my thing is going to take. Yeah, these are great. These are great.
Who has not seen the Sikh word, she has the.
Well, let's save that for the discussion. There's a lot to talk about here. I want to hear everyone's opinions and so on and so forth, and takes on it. We have a lot of experts here in the stuff I'm going to be talking about. We have experts on East Africa, Indians in East Africa, Sikhs in East Africa. We have UK citizens here, former UK citizens. So I'm going to be talking about all that. I want to hear everyone's perspectives. We have a lot of people who have insights into the American scene too. Okay, this was a rally in Georgia. So this was the runoff election for the Georgia state, the Georgia Senate seat between Herschel Walker, the Republican candidate, whose image is in the background, and Raphael Warnock, who was the Democratic candidate who eventually did win. But Nikki Haley was stumping for Herschel Walker in this speech. But again, I took this clip. She's talking about immigration again. So again, pay attention to her specific language.
Now, I am the daughter of Indian immigrants. They came here legally. They put in the time. They put in the price. They are offended by what's happening on that border. Legal immigrants are more patriotic than the leftists these days. They knew they worked to come into America, and they love America. They want the laws followed in America. So the only person that we need to make sure we deport is Warnock.
Okay. Well, there's a lot that needs to be unpacked there. I'm going to do it quickly, but it deserves more attention. The one thing I want to bring attention to, Raphael Warnock is an African American, right? He's the pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King used to preach. He's a descendant of, formerly enslaved people. I want to pay attention to the transnational dynamics that are happening. I'm going to be going into a more transnational context in a moment. She's calling for the deportation of a descendant of slaves. She, as a second generation immigrant to America, is calling for the deportation of someone whose ancestors were brought here involuntarily, right? So I want to keep this in mind for a second. I'm going to be talking about policing and who's doing the policing against whom, all right? So just keep that thought in your mind for a moment. So in both of these examples, we have several different tropes coming up. One is, of course, the model minority. I am a legal immigrant. I am a citizen. There are three things that I've identified in this language that occur again and again. There's the right kind of immigrant. That usually refers to social background, whether they're educated, working class, maybe ethnic background, and so on and so forth. The second is the right way or right method of coming here. I came here legally. I didn't come because I was compelled, because of war, because of famine, because of labor issues, and so on and so forth. We came here legally. We signed the papers, and so on and so forth. And the third thing is correct, right behavior, right? So we came here. We're productive citizens. We don't depend on welfare, social services, and so on and so forth. So those are the three tropes we see again and again, especially by minorities who are talking about new immigrants, right? It's an orthopraxy that they're enforcing, right? Running out of time, so I want to save some time for discussion. So I'm going to try to hurry through this last part. So Harmeet Dillon has made a name for herself, as she has been running for. She's been running for the Republican National Committee chairwoman. She ran in January. She lost pretty badly, about 30%, I think, about 2-1. But I think you can look for her to become the chairwoman at some point, because this is how things start. People persist. She's going to run again and again. She's got her name out there. She's made a name for herself as appearing on Tucker Carlson's TV show on Fox News, which I'm sure some of you know. He is a far-right commentator. He was described in the New York Times by New York Times columnist a few weeks ago as the most racist person on television, right? I'm just going to give you, if you haven't heard, I'm just going to give you a brief clip of what he used to say. Apparently he was either fired or quit, something like that. I try to pay as little attention to him as I can, but something happened. He's no longer on Fox News. But he was giving this kind of rhetoric for 6 or 7 years on a week, every week.
In the real world, the one that we live in, strong countries dominate weaker countries, and that trend shows no sign of changing. The very least you can say about the English is that they took their colonial responsibilities seriously. They didn't just take things, they added. When the US government withdrew from Afghanistan after 20 years, we left behind airstrips, shipping containers, and guns. When the British pulled out of India, they left behind an entire civilization, a language, a legal system, schools, churches, and public buildings, all of which are still in use today.
I'm so glad that they left behind a civilization, because they definitely didn't have any civilization.
Including Jallianwala Bagh.
Okay, so this is the kind of, this is the typical rhetoric he used to spew out for an hour every evening for many years, unimpeded, right? So we were talking about free speech absolutism. I mean, does that include the ability to have a large platform and a megaphone to spew out anything you want with impunity without any repercussions? That's a question we can think about when we talk about free speech. So Harmeet Dillon has made a name for herself appearing on Tucker Carlson's show many, many times over the last few years. This is just one of the stills. So remember, Harmeet Dillon is someone who's asserting that Sikh values are Republican values. She's also associating herself with an open racist. So we want to think about what kind of effect this has on in the public sphere, right? That's something we can come back to in the discussion. I'm going to just try to accelerate the end of the paper. So let's see. So Tucker Carlson in that clip, he referred to the English empire. No one ever refers to the American empire. You look at the political leaders, whether it's Joe Biden, Donald Trump, even Tucker Carlson, they don't say American empire. This is a nation that has 800 military bases around the world, probably the deepest penetration of military power, well, not probably, it's the deepest penetration of military power that the world has ever seen and maybe ever will see. And yet it's not described as an empire. That may work to their advantage because those things, their power may be, the power of the American empire may be measured in inverse proportion to the way it's spoken about explicitly in the public sphere. In other words, that which is so taken for granted, unspeakable. I mean, most Americans don't think about all our American military bases all over the world on a daily basis, but they're there. That's what's consolidating this empire in actuality. It's this monopoly on violence on a global scale. So I want us to think about power in different ways. Not only the military power, but the silent compulsion of ideas, of activities, of ideologies, of types of economic relations, in the structures that precede us when we come into this world, and they're going to live after us after we leave this world. These are the structures that are guiding our thoughts, our behaviors, our opportunities, our movements in different parts of the world. So that's when we look at the American empire. There was a time where we may have conflated whiteness and empire in the American context, right? We think about the Monroe Doctrine, manifest destiny, these ideas that it's the white man's burden, right? It's the white race it's their destiny to conquer the world and bring and leave civilization behind whenever they leave, right? So when we look at these figures, we should take note that America is increasingly becoming a multiracial empire, right? There are new faces coming. The imperial structures remain even as new groups take the reins of power, but people who look different. So I'm going to just throw this out there briefly. I'm not going to go into detail, but we have some experts in East Africa and the UK here. Hope to hear your all's thoughts about this. So there's been a recent wave of minority leaders taking the top reins of power, including the prime ministership of the UK. All three of these figures, Priti Patel on the left, Rishi Sunak, the current Prime Minister of the UK, and Suella Braverman on your right, they're all interestingly, they're from families that migrated to East Africa first and then came to the UK. All three of these figures were born in the UK, but they have a heritage that their families came from East Africa to the UK. And they've all taken the reins of power, essentially, including the prime ministership. It's a very interesting phenomenon. They're all members of the Tory party, which is the rough equivalent of the Republican Party, the right wing, the far right wing in the US, right? So, oh, sorry, wrong computer. Okay, so this is an image of, so Priti Patel was the Home Secretary. They're responsible for domestic policy in the UK. This is a kind of infamous photo of her, standing coolly aside while someone is being deported, taken out of their house. It was a photo opportunity. I think it happened in 2021. On the right, so she was, when Boris Johnson was deposed or whatever happened to him, she resigned, the cabinet resigned. So she resigned as Home Secretary. And when Rishi Sunak came in as Prime Minister, he appointed Suella Braverman as the new Home Secretary. So this is a picture of her. You guys can caption this. I don't know what's happening. She looks very happy. Apparently, she's in Rwanda, so she introduced a scheme that illegal immigrants from the UK are going to be flown to Rwanda. And these apparently are builders in Rwanda who are going to build the structures where the deportees are going to be housed. And she looks very happy for some reason. So this is okay, these are, again, I want us to think about, take one step back and think about what is happening here in the public sphere. As I put at the caption at the beginning, these are children of immigrants who are now policing immigration. So we talked about Bhagat Singh Cairn yesterday extensively. there are different ways of policing this boundary between whiteness and non-whiteness, which is also just a boundary between have and have not, privilege and non-privilege, right? These people who are one way is to expand the category, as Bhagat Singh Thind tried to do, to include me also in the privilege category. Another way is to turn around and police the boundary, to make sure that after we get in this category, no one else who is unsuitable will get in this category. And I'm positing that this is, in a way, a much more effective way of policing the boundary than white people saying, we don't want any non-whites in the boundary. We're going to have acceptable people to us, and then they're going to police the boundary. And this makes it a situation that's very difficult to pinpoint, very difficult to name, and there's less accountability because it's minorities themselves doing it. So how can they be racist? They're of that same, they're of that same racial group, right? So this is a very ingenious strategy in a way. And we're seeing the same thing. So I showed you, all these different examples. Harmeet Dhillon, Nikki Haley, Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, all of them are immigrants. They all happen to be immigrant women who are now stepping into the role of policing the boundary of immigration. So I want us to think about, we can talk about it in the discussion, why immigration is such an important topic for maintaining the structures of empire and why these figures are being put in these positions to do the work. And I'm going to leave it there because I've gone way over the time I wanted to, but I look forward to the discussion.
You're welcome.
Can I just say that I've got the microphone again that we need for the recording? So just put up your hands and I will come to you. Oh, of course, I'm sorry. I meant for later. Apologies.
So we have a respondent for our panel. Dr. Opinderjit Kaur Takhar, MBE, is Associate Professor of Sikh Studies and Director of the Center for Sikh and Punjabi Studies at the University of Wolverhampton in the UK. In January 2022, she was elected as President of Theology and Religious Studies in the UK. She has published widely on Sikhs through books and journal articles, as well as teaching resources on Sikhs and Sikhi. Her research is widely disseminated in the British Sikh community through projects such as raising awareness of organ donation amongst Sikhs, on developing Punjabi digital tools, and on addressing Gurdwara governance when exploring the younger generation's engagement with Sikhi and the Gurdwaras. She is a regular consultant to the BBC on Sikh-related matters and was honored with the Sikh Jewel Award in November 2021 at the House of Lords in London. She was named as Inspirational Woman of the Year by Asian Today in 2020 and Influencer of the Year at the British Indian Awards in 2019. More recently, Opinderjit has had the pleasure to work with Doris and many colleagues here on the edited volume Global Sikhs. And as of yesterday, she has been appointed as Interim Associate Dean for Research and Knowledge Exchange.
So thank you, Basharaji, to the team here at UCR and also to the community for inviting me to be here with you. It's always a pleasure to be here, and it's always so lovely to catch up with colleagues and to be able to meet new friends and make new friends as well. So thank you to Randeep and Puninder, both of them for sharing their research on the misrecognition of Sikh identity and right-wing politics. Randeep shared his thoughts on how mistaken identity has been examined in his research through the lens of race and religion. And this also begs the question of what is the role of religion in public life. So it's about representation, but it's also about going beyond the textbook version of religion and very much placing an emphasis on the lived experience of the Sikhs. Randeep also highlighted how the CNN report, first of all, emphasised Langar, etc., but the very fraught understanding of the reporters about Sikhi, about the Sikhs, is very evident in that report. The report also was produced, the purpose for which it was produced was to kind of discuss whether there would be kind of, this revenge from the Sikh community following the attacks on the Gurdwara. So Sikhs embracing right-wing politics is a phenomenon that very much exists, as Puninder has stated in his research. Sikhs in diaspora have had to lobby and engage with policymakers on a whole range of issues, from exemptions to wearing the crash helmet to their right to wear the kirpan in public places. Activism groups in the USA argue that Sikh values are American values. Foreign trades and how this impacts on the government's approach to Sikh activism is key to discussions around Sikhs in public life. For example, Puninder brought up the examples of previous Home Secretary Priti Patel and current Home Secretary Suella Braverman in the UK. So now I'll just take a step forward now in discussing, not too long, about how religion does impact in public life. So, as you'll all know, today it's the coronation of King Charles. And this very much, for the first time ever in the coronation of a monarch in the UK, focuses on faith and religion in public life. So there have been hand-selected faith leaders from each of the major faiths in the UK to actually play a key role in the coronation of King Charles today. Lord Opinderjit Singh of Wimbledon has been selected as the faith representative for British Sikhs. Now, what British Sikhs feel about that, what their views are for that, is a discussion for another day. But nevertheless, what it emphasises is that Sikhs in the UK very much are comfortable with using this notion of what British Sikh identity means. It's a term that's openly used. It's a term that, according to the British Sikh survey in 2013, right up until the current one just a few months ago, it stated something like 90% of Sikhs in the UK are comfortable with using this identity. So today's coronation is very much about acknowledging the diverse nature of British society. So for the first time ever in history, rather than there being an emphasis on the pledge from the peers, for the first time today, the emphasis has been on the pledge of the people. Okay, so everywhere across the world, people from different faiths, different regions, etc., are being encouraged to pledge their allegiance to the king from wherever they are in the world. And actually, this is really important because just a number of the media representations of Prince Charles being coronated today, actually, the image that was used was him wearing a patka on a recent visit to a Gurdwara in Luton, which is a kind of on the outskirts of London. So this very much emphasises that in the UK, society generally is pretty comfortable with who the Sikhs are and what the Sikhs look like, which was quite a shock to me when I landed at LAX a few days ago, and I was asked about the purpose of my visit here, and I said I'm here at a Sikh Studies Conference, and the look on the person's face, it's, who are the Sikhs? What are they? They had absolutely no idea. So the reason for me mentioning that is that actually there is a big difference from what I see in public understanding of who the Sikhs are in the US with the UK. However, despite all of this, I've been talking to a number of you about this over the last couple of days. Despite all of this understanding, this pretty comfortableness with being identified as being a British Sikh, a very damning report was released last week. This report is known as the Bloom Review. It's also got the title of Does Government Do God? Okay? And in terms of the remit for this review, this is a report that actually took 4 years of public money to write. And in all honesty, it's a total piece of crap, especially towards the Sikh community. It actually paints the British Sikh community in an extremely damaging light. If you read the report, 156 pages, there is a lot of focus on Sikh extremism in there. These are Colin Bloom's terms, not mine. Nowhere in the report is there any justification of how he's actually using the term extremism here. But then to go a step further, he also uses this whole new term, pro-Khalistani extremism, without, again, giving any justification for, for his terms of reference. What is Sikh extremism, and then how does this differ from what he labels as pro-Khalistani extremism? And all of this in the light of Prince Charles, a lot of the media images of him wearing a patka in the Gurdwara. So this really begs the question then, despite Bloom, he made a statement that faith is a force for good in the UK. So despite all of this, this report highlights a number of times all the good things we did, just like the CNN report. We're good for providing langar, we're good for providing oxygen seva. But actually, behind closed doors, all we are is a bunch of bullies and misogynists. And this is something that very much comes across in 11 pages on something that Bloom refers to as small pockets of resistance in the UK. So on an issue that's just in small pockets, in other words, around extremism, pro-Khalistani activity, he takes 11 pages in the report to actually focus on Sikh extremism and his term, pro-Khalistani extremism. For Islamist extremism, which we know is an issue in Europe, 2 paragraphs in that whole report. On Hindu nationals, 1 paragraph. Despite everything that's been happening on the streets of the UK between right-wing Hindus and Muslim groups. Okay, so again, this begs the question, why 11 pages on something that's apparently such a small issue? He has 22 recommendations in this report. And out of those 22 recommendations, 3 focus explicitly on the Sikhs. Okay, yes, he mentions that there needs to be a greater degree of faith literacy or religious literacy in the UK, which we agree, which as a Sikh community, we've been arguing for a long time, although there's a pretty good public understanding of who the Sikhs are, there still needs to be a lot of resource, very similar to what Tejpal was talking about earlier on, as in resources that represent the lived experience of Sikhs. Very much this emphasis that we need to move away from textbook, stereotypical, monolithic definitions of Sikhi and Sikhs, basically. So, what I'm trying to highlight here is that as a Sikh community, in the British Sikh community, I very much feel are divided over this Bloom report at the moment. Some only see, their mention of langar, or, we're great for langar, we're great for food banks, and also almost turning a blind eye to these reports of extremism and bullying in the community. And I'm sorry to say, but Lord Singh is key to a lot of that perception of negativity towards the Sikhs in the UK as well. So from the Centre for Sikh and Punjabi Study, and again I've been talking to a couple of you about this who are very interested in getting involved in this as well, is that we are going to write a report, we are going to rewrite our response to the government in the sense that this report cannot stay on the internet and be accessible. So, for example, university students who are about to study the Sikhs, who know nothing about the Sikhs, they will be quoting this report and representing us as this bunch of bullies and misogynists. So very much, we can't just take this lying down. We have to absolutely do something about it. And also what's shocking in the report as well is that he makes a recommendation that any out-of-school provision, so anything that kids do outside of the normal school hours needs to be governed, needs to be safeguarded. Absolutely, nobody has a problem with that. Yeah, absolutely, they should be safeguarded in those places. But within this, he highlights the classes that are associated with Gurdwara. He highlights madrasas as well. Nowhere does he mention Sunday schools or church-related schools. So again, very much this emphasises that, it kind of highlights the hidden agenda behind this report, very much coming across as an attack on non-Christian minority faiths in the UK. I'll wrap this up pretty soon because we want to give you guys focus time as well to be able to focus on this. Also, I just really want to highlight that Colin Bloom is the faith advisor to the government in the UK, a Tory himself. Immediately after doing his, after releasing his report, he was instantly on India media channels. All the India media channels picked up. They didn't give a damn what was that in the rest of those 156 pages. Their concern was only with those 11 pages which highlight so-called Sikh extremism in the UK. And this comes just a couple of weeks after The Guardian had published an absolutely appalling report on how Sikh Women's Aid leaked WhatsApp messages between them and Preet Kaur Gill MP, who is our first elected Sikh MP in the UK. And what Sikh Women's Action Network very much highlighted is that actually our Gurdwara are unsafe places. Do not send your child unattended to the Gurdwara. They'll get raped there. They'll get abused there. And so, for those of, somebody mentioned earlier on that activism is in our blood. As a Sikh, how can we possibly just turn a blind eye to somebody labelling our Gurdwara as unsafe? Okay, fair enough. I do admit that there have been some cases of abuse taking place in Gurdwara, but then to label the whole of them as being unsafe is absolutely something that we're not going to be lying down. And so again, it's turning to media, it's turning to these tools that we have in order to express our absolute disgust at this whole divide and rule policy, which very much is employed by the media in the UK. I'd just like to finish with the whole example around these Sikh chairs that were to be established, across India, but also one in the UK and one in Canada. Okay, in media language, Canada and the UK are seen by the media, by whichever governments, as actually being the hotbeds of extremist activity outside of India. So again, hopefully both of our speakers highlighted these kinds of tensions in their talk. So I'll hand over to them now because, it's your feedback that will help them shape their final thesis as well. Thank you.
Okay, so we're a little bit tighter on time than we planned, but we'll get to lunch and let's hear from as many different folks as possible. I think I saw the first hand there, you sir.
Hey, two-ish questions. That's really one question. After the colonization of the Sarkari Khalsa of the Sikh Empire, we were often used as wedge by the Raj, right? Whether it's the 1857 rebellion, and Sikhs were used as wedge between the Raj and the rebellion. Whether it's the frontier, and we were used as a wedge between us and the Afghans. And even continuing, so I guess the first question is, do you see a direct line between that and this? Second kind of question is, have you looked like this might be a little newer here, right? But from my recollection, the EDL in England has used Sikhs as like a wedge as well, right? Like this is the good minority compared to the rest of these folks. And even recently in Canada, the truckers' convoy that was against the mandates, mask mandates and the vaccine mandates, used Sikhs. There was a lot of Sikhs as part of that, as, again, another wedge. Do you see that, like, lines that connect all of this together as well?
Okay, and I think Dr. Hundle in the back was the second, and then the third I saw was Dr. Fennick.
Are we doing the questions all at once or one by one?
Let's do one by one.
Let's do one by one. Okay, you're right. Let's do that.
I absolutely see it as a pattern that is in service of a wider structure, which I'm identifying here as empire. It's absolutely the same pattern. This is just the latest manifestation of it. So as I was saying, with regard to the Republican, Donald Trump, those currents have been going since Edmund Burke. It's nothing new. There's been a conservative thread, whether it's in power or not in power. In more recent American politics, it's the 60s, Barry Goldwater and these kinds of people, that more recently the Tea Party. There's been a thread going along all the time. This is what I encourage us to look at, and a way to look at it is that even if political parties change, even if different political parties come into power, look at the underlying structures that are being served, right? So even we can see in contemporary American politics, we have a Democratic administration now. How different is their foreign policy from the previous administration? How different has it been in the post-war period since 1945 till today? Has there been real gaps in the American foreign policy, their covert operations, their interventions in other countries? Has there been any real difference? So some people describe this as two wings of the same bird, right? It may be Republican, maybe Democrat. So what I encourage us to look at as a Sikh community, as any kind of minority community, because we're in a more precarious position in the way we align ourselves with either party or neither party and so on and so forth, look at the underlying structures. Don't pay attention to the surface level phenomena. Look at the imperial structures, who is serving which structures. And that was a great insight. It's absolutely, Sikhs have been used, in 1857, there were the model minority. They were given a lot of advantages in the post-1857, the canal colony. That's a whole history we can talk about at some other time. But absolutely, it's been in service of empire. I wanted to say, I didn't have time to get to this in my talk, but the idea of the sepoy, right? The sepoy is a distortion of the word sipahi, the Persian word sipahi, which means soldier. In the Sikh tradition, we talk about sant sipahi, saint soldier, right? That's an ideal, miri piri, right? Someone who embodies both spiritual and temporal ideals in one being, right? The sepoy in the English connotation, in the English Empire, were native soldiers who were doing the work of empire, right? The English only had a very limited amount of people in India in the entire time that they were in India, more than 200 years. There was a very small amount of people, but they were controlling hundreds of millions of people. How were they doing that? They were using the resources of the natives themselves this is an extension of that. This is a sepoy model where you're using natives to do the police work of empire. So absolutely, I would say this is a part of that.
Wow, that was great. All three, thank you. A tiny lead up to my question is this. One of the more questionable statements our friend Khushwant Singh made was in the late 1970s when he was speaking about the even more questionable Sanjay Gandhi. And he said, well, at least Sanjay Gandhi is a man of action, okay? And this sort of, the love of the strong man. And of course, when Modi gave the Houston talk, the Howdy Modi talk, and you saw some of the coverage of this, of course, we know the twice impeached ex-president had introduced him, but in that crowd, we saw many Sikhs. Okay. So my question is, how is this strong man, this love of the strong man, explained in the context of the dialogic engagement about which you spoke, Puneet?
Again, a great question. That was the example I gave of Jasbir Singh, the founder of Sikhs for Trump. So at the end, he says, he's made our military more powerful. He's made our economy more powerful. We're winning, right? So this isn't like this. This is an affiliation with, exactly as you said, a strong figure. It's a law and order. We used to call it, Nixon called it law and order. We have law and order candidates, that not only Republicans, sometimes they can be Democrats too. They're people who are going to come in and they're going to sweep away the rubbish, the undesirable people. They're going to make sure the trains run on time, make sure there's no crime on the streets, all right? So that I want us to think critically about, us as a Sikh community, and even scholars who are examining, the Sikh Bani and how it manifests in political structures. How do Sikh values align with the strongman, the tyrant, the oppressor, and so on and so forth? Do they align? That's something I'll leave open to this discussion. And again, what are the incentives that people are getting for aligning themselves in that way? That's mine.
Yeah, thank you, both of you, for your presentations. They were great. Randeep, I really appreciated just how you were teasing out the categories of race and religion and thinking about this idea of symbolic violence in relation to the images that you were showing us. And I guess my question is, so does the process of secularization that came with modernity that you're tracing in critical religious studies, does that already presume a racialization or like a racial project? Or what is at stake for you in terms of bringing critical race studies and critical religious studies together again? Like what is at stake in reassessing that literature or kind of stressing that point in your analysis and in terms of thinking about this problem of misrecognition? And then Punu, thank you for your presentation also. And I was just thinking about the East African Asian diaspora and them as a kind of intermediary class, but also how their racial position was also shaped by issues of class and religious and caste identity. And Puninder was talking about Makhan Singh and the Punjabi community and their role in kind of labor struggles and anti-colonial solidarities with Africans. And so I'm just curious if issues of class or caste and religion kind of undergird the model minority position and how it's playing out in the US among right-wing Sikhs, and also obviously like the Gujarati East African Asian community in the British context, their proximity to whiteness, to Brahmanism, to an elite class position, and how is all that kind of mapping out? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. Sometimes, I have a grammatical problem. Sometimes I wonder about what is Sikh studies? Are we studying Sikhs? Is it a study of Sikhism? And I often wonder about how these two things are kind of conflated all the time. And I'm always worried about how, or I guess I'm sort of perplexed by how Sikh and Punjab why are they so metonymic? Why are they so exchangeable? Or why do they sometimes stand for one another? And how did that happen? And even when we're trying to understand racialization and the way that it happens sort of in the diaspora, we already assume that Punjabi and Sikh are somehow related in some close and important way. I think Michael's kind of paper today talks about how sometimes that might be refused actually in the very earliest moments of diaspora formation. And so I think that I suppose I'm perplexed by the very thing that I think I'm studying, and I don't know if there's actually a coherent object there. And so I suppose I find myself asking, how is it that this sort of perplexing conceptual configuration has happened? And so I guess I look to the ways that the Sikh, which is, I guess I sort of bracket some of these questions by referring to the Sikh as something that could both be sort of a noun and an adjective, as a way to kind of defer on trying to figure out what this thing is. And so to answer your question, my impetus is really kind of a confusion about what is the thing that's bringing sort of intellectual inquiry to bear here.
That's great. I want to build on that answer. I think these kind of questions I'm looking at open up this conflation of identity with a particular ethnic, linguistic, territorial identity. It does it inadvertently by going against the common sense, as I said, the common sense understanding that these are Sikh political beliefs. This is the minority. These are the occupations they occupy. You know, these are the political parties they vote for. This, in a perverse way, by challenging that, by doing something completely unexpected, it gives us an opportunity, and we should, in Buddhist tradition, they say embrace your friends, but embrace your enemies even closer to you, because they allow you to express your practice of compassion and understanding. Because if everything is already familiar to you, then there's no critical way to enter into the question. So we have to thank Jasbir Singh and Nikki Haley in a way, because it gives us an opportunity to think critically. So this is a whole topic that needs to be open. I hope someone will, who's more of an expert than I am in this particular movement from East Africa to the UK. As you expressed, they do form this interesting layer. So we have to think again as a global racialized hierarchy, right? They have different races have different functions in different nation states at different times. So in East Africa, we saw this in South Africa too. We talked about Gandhi a little bit yesterday. Indians formed this middle layer between the whites, who were the colonizers, the absolutely privileged, unquestioned, holders of power, and indigenous black Africans. So they formed the middle layer. This is one of the reasons they were resented by people like Idi Amin, as we have to get these parasites out of the country, and the expulsion, and so on and so forth, right? So this is very interesting how they're taking that same kind of racial positionality into the UK now, possibly, which they're brokering a relationship between the white power structure and other undesirable minorities. They've now become a desirable minority. Rishi Sunak is one of the richest families in the UK, as I understand, a multi-billionaire or billionaire or whatever. It's not an accident that he became the Prime Minister of the UK, right? It would be interesting if a working class South Asian, so the Prime Minister, as many of you know, is not a popularly elected position. It's elected by the Tory party, which is a couple hundred people, I think. They elected him. It would be interesting if a working class South Asian won a popular election in England, election of the whole electorate, and that person became Prime Minister. That would be much more interesting for someone who's already the highest level of privilege, one of the richest people in the UK. Priyamvada Gopal, whose work I really enjoy, she said that this is simply a transfer of power from one elite to another, one elite group to another, from elite white English persons to elite Brahmin Indian person, a very rich elite. So it's not really it's not a structural change at all. Again, I think that speaks to how these structures persist. They were there in East Africa, and they persist. They carry over all the way into the UK, and they reproduce themselves. So I think that's an excellent insight, an important insight. And we do have to think about class. I didn't have time to get into the class issues in the U.S. case, but there are certainly issues too, as who is aligning themselves with which party and why. We have some activists here who can speak to that. Working class South Asians have different concerns, different political affiliations for different reasons, right? They're not a monolithic group. Asians are not a monolithic group. Rishi Sunak is not the same as a working class Indian person who works in a factory. They don't have different interests, and so on and so forth. So we do have to tease these things apart. Thanks for that question.
Hi, we're at time, so I'm going to be super quick. So this is a question for Puninder. You ended your talk with this kind of expression of, the right-wing Sikhs as like the sepoy who is aligning with power and policing the boundaries of citizenship, of everything else. In the beginning of your talk, you talked about Sikh advocacy groups as being this kind of assumed default left, maybe center-left kind of groups. I guess in a few words, my question would be, are they though? When you look at who these advocacy groups are aligning with and who they're holding up, are they really left or center left? When you have alliances under the guise of religious liberty with things like the Beckett Group. When you have Simranjit Singh talking about the murder of a policeman in Texas, and I think the rhetorical phrase was something like, "This proves that we can be citizens too." When you have Valerie Kaur literally praying in an ardas for the continuation of the Pentagon for the next century, are they really? Or within that pragmatism and that assumption of liberalism, is there not that kind of slant towards the sepoy?
Well, this is an excellent point. I would say there is still is a sepoy aspect to it, but I think Arvind said this yesterday. It's liberalism disguised as conservatism, right? There is a structure, an imperial. So this is the main argument I'm trying to make. There's an imperial structure that persists. That if you're for the perpetuation of any kind of law and order, any kind of, if you're in service, acting in service of an order, you're not really affiliated with a political party. When I say center-left, I think I'm talking about self-identification and on a surface level. Like someone like these public figures we have, like Simranjit Singh, and there are many others, right, in the public sphere, active in the public sphere, on social media, they wouldn't identify themselves as right-wing or supporters of empire. They would probably identify, I'm guessing, as center to left, right? Self-identify. But you make an excellent point. Is it really, are they really center-left if these are, again, the two wings of the same bird? If they're, in the end of the day, they're supporting these same, perpetuating these same structures, inadvertently perhaps. They think they're doing the work of we have issues in America with the left because we don't have any left. There's no left in America. It left. It left a long time ago. A long time ago. So again, the political spectra in Europe, what left means in Europe, what it means in India, they're totally different. So what we call left, whoever we call Bernie Sanders, he's basically a centrist liberal in any other place in Europe and so on and so forth. But that's a great insight. Yeah.
One last question.
Sorry, I've always been a backbencher, and here I am.
Just speak into it. It's
okay. Sorry, I came a little late. I was kind of catching up with my beauty sleep, and so here I am. A few things I've been told to make it kind of short. I've been in Riverside for 30 years plus. Wherever I go, I'm the only turbaned Sikh or person anywhere. I think we have to realize that there is activism and use of whatever we can make use of. If you're on a Democrat side, Republican side, get in there, activism, and thank you, Dr. Saab, for including this in the conference. I think it's very important because we can understand what's happened before, but what's going to happen is in our hands. We have to own our identity. We have to get out there, be on the table, so we can actually control what we want for things to happen. So it's kind of short, but I don't know, there are lots of questions in that little statement, but it's something to digest and go home and please become activists.
Purvinder had a question too, if you could. One more question. Well, go ahead, please.
Just wait.
I just wanted to make some qualifications. Oh, okay. The role of East African nations were not elites. It's not like Brahmin capital that's transnational. In a colonial structure, they were in the middle. And Rishi Sunak's, the trajectory of East Africans in Britain it's not like reproduction of transnational elite culture, say somebody like Salman Rushdie, Homi Bhabha. It's a completely different trajectory. What my understanding is that, if you read on the ways in which Jewish people became upwardly mobile, it was from the point of entry into the US, a working class Jew had, within a period of just 30 years, become a doctor, a professional, etc. This is very well documented. And in the case of East Africans, they do have certain advantages in the management of minority status because they've been a community for 90 years or 70 years, or sometimes 100 years in Britain. So Rishi Sunak is a very wealthy man through Indian wealth, through his wife, not his own wealth. Of course, there are many people of his generation who were sent to private schools, even people who were very middle income, lived very frugally, but spent a lot of money on educating their children. So I don't think that you can apply the elite to elite in Britain. I think it's much more complex than that. But they are, I mean, like they produce Makhan Singh, they do have a certain amount of political savvy. Most East Africans voted Labour for most of the time that they're there. There is a third generation that's emerging, which includes Suella Braverman, Rishi Sunak, which it's a very similar trajectory to Jewish migrants in the US. These are not elite people, but they are benefiting from educational opportunities. It's not like the Indian elites who dominate the American academy. It's a very different structure. So I just wanted to put that out to you, for you to...
Very briefly, it's too complicated to
Yes,
give
it is very
but
complicated.
they did from a middle layer. I said they weren't elites. The white power structure were the elites in Africa. And Rishi Sunak, even if he married into money, he's a billionaire. It's not an accident. He's not a working class person being elected as prime minister. Even if it's proximity because of marriage, he's a billionaire. He's one of the richest people. That's not an accident. That's structural.
The elitist tools, in a way, Stanford, MBA, and whatever else.
Sure. Well, I mean, so it could be his personal endowments, his intelligence, his resourcefulness. Sure, but I'm talking about this on a structural level. These people don't come into these positions by accident, especially the prime ministership of the UK. It's not by accident that he happens to be one of the richest people in England, even if he married into it. But point taken. There's much more. Like Makhan Singh, there was an important labor movement in Africa. Not everyone was right wing. But why are these children of immigrants, why are they aligning themselves with the Tory party? That's my question. But why are the people who are running the country right now Asians in the Tory party? That's the question.
Remember, Rishi Sunak did not go to the vote to the Conservative, the general population. What was her woman? Liz Truss.
Yeah.
She did that. He could have done it at that time. But the Tory party knows that Rishi Sunak will not be elected on the basis of the Conservative vote. So it's a completely exceptional sort of case. And I really want to point out, his 780 million comes from his wife through Infosys. So it's an alliance between India, rich India, and a British person. And there are many Rishis. I mean, if you look at the professional class, there are many East Africans, the consultants, in many fields, but they're often children of either working class. My mum was a factory worker. If you look at Grinder Chadha, they're all, so it really is, when I wrote Movers and Makers, and I read a great deal around how the very rapid upward mobile, it is within a generation, it's 30 years. And so I think that is their advantage. But it's not the ways in which the Nehrus were produced, or the Benazir Bhuttos, or Salman Rushdie, or almost a huge amount of the American Academy. It feels to me as 95% of the people who dominate the American Academy have been to 5 schools in India. And it is the Oxbridge network, so I think there are, as you say, it's much more complex than that.
No, thanks for adding that nuance. It's not so simple, but there are unmistakable, my family, my brother-in-law is of East African heritage. We have my family in Toronto. I have many family members of that diasporic movement. I'm not condemning them in any way. I'm saying the imperial structures. Who are the imperial structures allowing to come into positions of power? That's never an accident.
Yeah.
Suella Braverman. Why do we have a far right children of immigrants who's the chief enforcer for immigration in the UK? why is she in that position? It could have been anybody, right? But why has she been put in that position? It's conversation we can continue. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.